Chapter 6. When most people think of humanity's place in Halo's history, they imagine underdogs. They picture the desperate final years of the Human Covenant War. They picture colonies burning beneath Covenant fleets and soldiers fighting impossible battles simply to buy a few more hours of survival. Humanity's modern story is defined by resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story of a species that repeatedly finds itself outmatched and somehow survives anyways. That image, while accurate for one period in history, hides a remarkable truth. There was once a time when humanity stood among the greatest powers in the galaxy. There was a time when humanity possessed worlds beyond counting, commanded fleets capable of challenging the Forerunners themselves, and ruled a civilization so vast that later generations would never fully understand its achievements. The people who fought the Covenant believed they were humanity at its peak. In reality, they were inheritors of a legacy that had been shattered long before recorded history began. The rise of ancient humanity occurred gradually across spans of time that are difficult to imagine. While the Forerunners expanded into a galaxy already shaped by the Precursors, humanity followed a different path. Their civilization emerged slowly, shaped by countless generations of exploration, adaptation, and growth. Colonies became nations. Nations became alliances. Alliances became something larger. Eventually, humanity spread across enormous regions of space. Many of these worlds have been lost to history. Their names vanished during the disasters that followed. Entire systems disappeared from surviving records. Yet fragments remain scattered throughout Forerunner archives and ancient accounts. Those fragments reveal a civilization that was ambitious, sophisticated, and extraordinarily resilient. Unlike the Forerunners, humanity did not organize itself around rigid castes. Their societies were diverse and often contradictory. Different worlds developed different traditions, different governments, and different philosophies. This diversity sometimes created internal conflict, but it also provided flexibility. Human civilization adapted quickly. New ideas spread rapidly. Solutions developed on one world could be refined and improved by another. This adaptability would become one of humanity's defining characteristics. The Precursors had noticed it long before anyone else. By the height of their expansion, humanity had established relationships with numerous neighboring civilizations. Among the most important were the San Shayum, a species that would eventually become known to later generations as the Prophets. Long before the Covenant existed, long before religious dogma reshaped their culture, the ancient San Shayum were respected allies of humanity. The partnership proved beneficial for both civilizations. Humanity contributed military strength, exploration, and expansion. The San Shayum brought scientific expertise, political influence, and advanced research. Together they formed one of the most significant alliances in galactic history. For thousands of years, the relationship flourished. Trade flowed between their worlds. Knowledge was exchanged freely. Joint projects pushed the boundaries of what both civilizations believed possible. It is one of Halo's greatest ironies that humanity and the ancestors of the Covenant's leadership were once allies. Millions of years later, neither side would remember. As humanity expanded, it inevitably encountered the shadow of the Akumene. The Forerunners remained the dominant power in the galaxy. Their territory dwarfed that of every rival civilization. Their technology remained unmatched. Yet humanity's growth did not go unnoticed. The species that the Precursors had once selected as their successor was becoming increasingly influential. For many Forerunners, this development was deeply uncomfortable. The memory of the Precursors' decision had never completely disappeared. Although ages had passed since the conflict, the underlying tension remained. Humanity represented more than another civilization. Humanity represented a question the forerunners had spent millions of years trying to answer. What had the precursors seen in them? As humanity continued to flourish, that question became increasingly difficult to ignore. The answer was not obvious. Humanity was not more advanced than the forerunners. It was not more powerful. It certainly did not possess greater territory. Measured through conventional standards, the Ecumene remained vastly superior. Yet humanity continued growing, continued to adapt, and they continued proving remarkably difficult to predict. The contrast between the two civilizations became increasingly clear. The forerunners valued stability. Humanity often embraced change. The forerunners built systems designed to endure for millions of years. Humanity built systems capable of evolving rapidly when circumstances demanded it. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they reflected fundamentally different ways of viewing the universe. Those differences fascinated the precursors. They worried the forerunners. Despite these tensions, outright conflict remained distant. Humanity and the Ecumene coexisted for vast spans of time. There were disagreements, territorial disputes, and political rivalries, but nothing that threatened galactic stability. Most citizens of either civilization likely assumed this arrangement would continue indefinitely. They were wrong. Beyond the borders of known space, another transformation was taking place. The corrupted remains of the precursors continued to evolve. The strange biological material scattered across remote regions of the galaxy had become something entirely new. What had once been intended as preservation was becoming a nightmare unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered. At first, the signs were subtle. Entire populations did not vanish overnight. Worlds were not consumed in a matter of days. The disaster began quietly. Isolated incidents appeared on remote colonies. Strange biological outbreaks emerged. Reports surfaced of unusual infections affecting both animals and intelligent species. Most observers treated these incidents as local problems. The galaxy was enormous. New diseases appeared constantly. Dangerous organisms were discovered with regularity. Nothing about these early reports suggested they represented the beginning of a catastrophe. The mistake is understandable. History's greatest disasters rarely announce themselves. By the time they become impossible to ignore, they are often far more advanced than anyone realizes. Ancient humanity would be the first major civilization to learn this lesson. The encounter would change them forever. It would reshape their future, redefine their relationship with the forerunners, and introduce the galaxy to a threat so terrifying that its name would one day be spoken with fear by every major civilization. The flood was coming, and humanity would meet it first. Chapter 7. The first encounters with the flood did not resemble a war. There were no massive fleets gathering along contested borders, no declarations of hostility, no warnings broadcast across interstellar networks. Most of the people who experienced the earliest outbreaks never realized they were witnessing the beginning of one of the greatest disasters in galactic history. At first, it appeared to be little more than a biological curiosity. The ancient records are incomplete, but they suggest that the earliest infections occurred on the outer edges of human-controlled space. Reports describe unusual organisms affecting native animal populations. Creatures exposed to the mysterious material often displayed dramatic behavioral changes. Some became unusually aggressive. Others developed physical abnormalities that conventional medicine struggled to explain. Entire populations of animals occasionally collapsed for reasons that seemed disconnected from any known disease. Such incidents were concerning, but not unprecedented. Humanity governed an enormous territory. Thousands of worlds existed beneath its influence. New forms of life were constantly being discovered. Strange illnesses emerged with regularity. Most local authorities treated these outbreaks as isolated incidents rather than signs of a larger pattern. Unfortunately, the flood thrives on exactly that kind of assumption. A conventional disease has limitations. It spreads according to predictable biological rules. It infects hosts, reproduces, and eventually encounters natural barriers that slow or stop its advance. The flood was something entirely different. It was not merely an organism, it was a system. Every infected creature became part of something larger. Every outbreak strengthened the whole. The people studying the early infections had no framework for understanding what they were facing. As a result, they asked the wrong questions. They searched for pathogens. They searched for environmental contaminants. They searched for genetic abnormalities. They never considered that the infection itself might possess purpose. As the years passed, isolated incidents became reoccurring incidents. Reoccurring incidents became regional concerns. Scientific teams began comparing records from multiple systems and discovered disturbing similarities. Organisms separated by enormous distances displayed nearly identical symptoms. Entirely unrelated species were undergoing comparable transformations. Whatever was happening, it was not natural. The realization arrived slowly, but once it arrived, it became impossible to ignore. Ancient humanity responded the way any advanced civilization would. Researchers were deployed, samples were collected, quarantine measures were established. Fleets transported scientists and medical personnel to affected regions. Entire institutions shifted their focus towards understanding the threat. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the crisis might be contained. Humanity possessed extraordinary resources. Their civilization had overcome countless challenges throughout its history. They had cured diseases, survived ecological disasters, and solved problems that earlier generations would have considered impossible. Many believed this situation would prove no different. Those hopes disappeared as the infection continued evolving. What horrified researchers was not merely the rate at which the organism spread, it was its adaptability. Every attempt to understand it revealed something new. Every solution appeared temporary. The flood learned. It adjusted. It absorbed useful biological traits from infected hosts and incorporated them into its growing mass. Scientists who initially viewed the outbreaks as a biological problem gradually began describing them as something closer to a strategic opponent. The distinction was terrifying. Diseases do not learn. Diseases do not adapt with purpose. They do not appear to anticipate resistance. Yet evidence increasingly suggested that the flood was doing exactly that. Entire research teams dedicated their lives to understanding the phenomenon. Reports circulated through military and political leadership, warning that the situation was escalating beyond normal containment measures. Colonies that once appeared stable suddenly required emergency intervention. Evacuation plans were drafted. Quarantine zones expanded. Still, most of humanity remained unaware of the true danger. The affected regions represented only a fraction of human territory. Life continued normally on countless worlds. Citizens went to work. Governments conducted business. Trade routes remained active. The crisis was serious, but it still appeared manageable. History often contains moments like this, periods when catastrophe is already underway, but has not yet become visible to the broader population. Looking backward, later generations inevitably ask how nobody recognized the warning signs. The answer is usually simple. The warning signs did not look like history at the time. They looked like local problems, technical problems, administrative problems, the sort of problems civilizations solve every day. Ancient humanity continued searching for answers. What they found was worse than any prediction. Investigators eventually discovered that the infection was not simply spreading through contact, it was transforming entire ecosystems. Native wildlife became vectors, food chains became vectors, environmental systems became vectors. Every new world presented fresh opportunities for adaptation. The flood was not invading planets, it was consuming them. The distinction would become one of the most defining lessons of the coming war. A conventional enemy occupies territory. Territory can be reclaimed. Armies can be defeated. Borders can be restored. The flood did not occupy worlds. It converted them. Every victory increased its strength. Every casualty expanded its resources. Every mistake became permanent. Humanity was the first civilization to fully understand this reality. Unfortunately, understanding a threat and stopping it are very different things. As reports continued arriving from the frontier, military leaders became increasingly involved in containment efforts. Fleets were reassigned. Defense networks expanded. Strategic planners began preparing for scenarios that would have seemed absurd only decades earlier. The language used in official communications changed as well. The infection was no longer described as an outbreak. It was described as an enemy unlike any humanity had ever faced. Somewhere within the military hierarchy, commanders were already beginning to emerge who understood the scale of the challenge ahead. They recognized that the conflict would not be won through research alone. It would require sacrifice, discipline, and strategic brilliance on a level rarely demanded by history. Among those leaders was a figure whose name would eventually become legendary. His rise still lay ahead. For now, humanity stood at the edge of a growing darkness, struggling to understand a threat that should not have existed. The worlds under attack represented only the beginning. Every successful infection increased the flood's strength. Every delay increased the cost of future victories. The galaxy remained unaware of what was coming. The Forerunners certainly remained unaware. Confident in their golden age, the rulers of the Akumene continued looking forward to the future, without realizing that humanity was already fighting a war for survival. A war that would soon spread far beyond human space. A war that would eventually force the Forerunners to confront the consequences of decisions made millions of years earlier. Chapter 8. As the flood spread through the outer region of human space, the crisis began transforming ancient humanity itself. For generations, humanity had been defined by expansion. New worlds were settled. Trade routes connected distant systems. Scientific discoveries opened doors that previous generations had never imagined possible. The future appeared limitless. While political disagreements existed, as they always do within large civilizations, most people viewed the coming centuries with optimism. The flood changed that. Entire sectors found themselves reorganized around containment efforts. Resources that had once funded exploration and infrastructure projects were redirected toward military production. Scientific institutions that had spent centuries pursuing advancement suddenly focused on survival. Colonies that once served as centers of commerce became defensive strongholds positioned along vulnerable frontiers. Humanity was adapting. The problem was that the flood adapted faster. Every victory seemed temporary. Every solution revealed a new complication. Worlds that appeared secured would suffer renewed outbreaks years later. Fleets dispatched to eliminate infected populations often discovered that fragments of the infection had already spread elsewhere. Military planners found themselves confronting an enemy that did not respect territory, diplomacy, logistics, or any of the assumptions upon which conventional warfare depended. The Flood did not seek victory in the traditional sense. It sought growth. That single difference rendered centuries of military theory nearly useless. As the conflict intensified, new leaders emerged throughout human space. Some were scientists attempting to understand the parasite. Others were politicians struggling to hold entire regions together under mounting pressure. Many were military commanders tasked with making impossible decisions. Among them, one figure gradually rose above all others. His name was Forthencho. Later generations would remember him as the Lord of Admirals, a title spoken with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. During his own lifetime, however, he was not viewed as a legend. He was simply a commander attempting to save his civilization from a threat that seemed to grow stronger with every passing year. The surviving records paint a picture of an extraordinary individual. Forthencho possessed many of the qualities humanity admired most. He was intelligent without being arrogant, decisive without being reckless, ambitious without losing sight of the lives entrusted to his command. Those who served under him frequently described a leader capable of inspiring confidence even in the darkest circumstances. That confidence would soon be tested. By the time Forthencho's influence began expanding throughout the military hierarchy, the Flood was no longer viewed as a regional crisis. Entire systems had been lost. Population centers vanished from maps. Fleets disappeared during containment operations. Every new report seemed worse than the one before it. The enemy remained poorly understood. This was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the conflict. Humanity knew the Flood was dangerous, but it still did not fully understand what it was facing. Researchers continued searching for a cure. Military analysts searched for weaknesses. Political leaders searched for solutions that might preserve both security and stability. The answers never came. Instead, the Flood continued evolving. Infected populations no longer behave like victims of disease. They move with purpose. They coordinate. They displayed intelligence that exceeded anything early researchers believed possible. Entire outbreaks began exhibiting patterns that suggested centralized decision-making. For many observers, this realization was profoundly unsettling. A disease could be cured, an enemy could be defeated. But what happens when a disease becomes an enemy? That question haunted humanity's leadership. Forthencho understood the implications better than most. Unlike many commanders, he refused to underestimate the threat. He recognized that humanity was not fighting a conventional war. Every strategic decision had to account for realities that would have sounded absurd only a generation earlier. Retreating from an infected world could spread the parasite. Attempting evacuation could spread the parasite. Allowing civilian populations to remain in place could spread the parasite. Every option carried terrible risks. The conflict gradually became defined by sacrifice. Worlds were abandoned. Colonies were quarantined. Entire populations found themselves isolated to prevent larger disasters. The decisions weighed heavily upon humanity's leaders, but they saw no alternative. Every system preserved today might save 10 tomorrow. Every painful sacrifice might prevent something worse. It was during this period that humanity's alliance with the San Shayum became more important than ever. The San Shayum had witnessed the crisis escalating alongside their human allies. Their scientists contributed valuable research. Their political institutions helped coordinate responses across vast distances. Their leaders shared humanity's growing fear that the flood represented something fundamentally different from any previous threat. Together, the two civilizations searched desperately for answers. Together, they failed to find them. Years became decades. Decades became centuries. The conflict expanded. What had once seemed like a series of isolated outbreaks evolved into a struggle consuming entire regions of the galaxy. The cost mounted steadily. Every victory demanded resources that became increasingly difficult to replace. Every setback strengthened the enemy. The psychological toll proved equally devastating. Generations grew up knowing nothing but war. Entire worlds reorganized their cultures around military necessity. Children born during the crisis often reached adulthood without remembering a time when the flood was not part of daily life. Humanity remained strong, but the burden was becoming impossible to ignore. And still, the flood advanced, somewhere beyond the front lines, hidden from the eyes of most of the galaxy. A terrible truth was slowly emerging. The flood was not simply adapting, it was becoming smarter. Each new outbreak seemed more coordinated than the last. Each campaign revealed behaviors that could not easily be explained through instinct or biology alone. Researchers struggled to understand how such a thing was possible. Military leaders cared less about the explanation than the consequences. An intelligent enemy was dangerous. An enemy that grew more intelligent with every victory was catastrophic. Forthencho began warning humanity's leadership that the conflict was entering a new phase. The assumptions that guided earlier campaigns could no longer be trusted. Strategies that succeeded yesterday might fail tomorrow. The flood was changing, and humanity needed to change with it. Many listened, some did not. Unfortunately, history has a habit of punishing civilizations that underestimate growing threats. Even as humanity fought for survival, another great power watched from afar. The Forerunners were aware that something unusual was occurring within human-controlled space. Reports reached them through various channels. Refugees carried stories. Trade networks transmitted rumors. Fragments of information crossed political boundaries. Yet the Ecumene remained largely unconcerned. From their perspective, humanity was dealing with a regional problem. Serious, perhaps. Tragic, certainly. But not something capable of threatening a civilization as vast and powerful as the Forerunners. They would eventually learn otherwise. For now, humanity stood alone. The flood continued growing. Forthencho continued preparing for a future that seemed increasingly grim. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the front lines, the parasite was evolving into something far more dangerous than anyone yet realized. Chapter 9. The first signs appeared in reports that many commanders initially dismissed as statistical anomalies. Entire regions that should have been lost were holding. Outbreaks that had followed predictable patterns suddenly slowed. In a handful of isolated systems, the flood appeared to abandon worlds it had once fought desperately to consume. Analysts searching through military records discovered similar incidents occurring across multiple sectors. At first, nobody understood what they were seeing. The flood had spent centuries expanding with relentless determination. Every projection suggested the situation would continue worsening. Yet scattered throughout the chaos were examples that seemed to contradict everything humanity believed about the parasite. Some infected worlds were becoming quiet. Others appeared strangely untouched. A few were even showing signs of recovery. The discovery spread quickly through military and scientific circles. Research teams were dispatched to investigate. Fleets altered course. Entire departments shifted their priorities in an effort to understand what was happening. Hope, something increasingly rare during those dark years, began to return. For generations, humanity had fought a war defined by retreat. Every victory came at enormous cost. Every strategic success merely delayed the next crisis. The possibility that the flood possessed a weakness, any weakness at all, represented the first genuinely encouraging development in centuries. Unfortunately, the truth would prove far more complicated. Investigations revealed a curious pattern. The worlds experiencing reduced flood activity shared common characteristics. In many cases, local populations had been subjected to extensive genetic and medical intervention. Environmental factors varied from system to system, but evidence repeatedly suggested the same conclusion. Certain human populations appeared less vulnerable to infection. Scientists approached the discovery cautiously. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, yet the data continued accumulating. Study after study produced similar results. Human subjects exposed to specific conditions demonstrated increased resistance to flood conversion. Entire populations appeared more difficult for the parasite to assimilate. The implications were staggering. Humanity might be developing immunity. The announcement spread throughout civilization like wildfire. After centuries of fear and sacrifice, the possibility of salvation seemed within reach. Politicians celebrated. Citizens celebrated. Military leaders cautiously allowed themselves a degree of optimism they had not felt in generations. Research funding expanded dramatically as governments poured resources into understanding the phenomenon. The Sanshayum celebrated alongside their allies. Together, the two civilizations pursued what appeared to be the greatest scientific breakthrough in their history. Yet beneath the excitement, troubling questions remained unanswered. The flood was still spreading. Worlds were still being lost. Entire fleets continued disappearing. If humanity truly possessed a cure, why was the war continuing? The answer emerged gradually, and only after tremendous sacrifice. The resistance was real. The immunity was not. Humanity had misunderstood what it was observing. The populations displaying increased resistance had not cured the infection. Instead, something about humanity itself had forced the flood to alter its behavior. The parasite appeared to be abandoning certain targets and prioritizing others. To observers living through the crisis, the distinction became academic. To future historians, it would become one of the most important misunderstandings in Halo history. Humanity did not realize this immediately. Instead, convinced they had discovered a path toward victory, military leadership adopted increasingly aggressive strategies. Entire campaigns were launched with the objective of denying infected worlds to the parasite. Fleets entered systems once considered hopelessly lost. Colonies underwent extensive population relocations. Vast regions of space were subjected to measures so extreme that later generations would struggle to comprehend them. Worlds were burned. Not conquered, not occupied, but burned. Entire planetary populations were evacuated when possible. When evacuation proved impossible, harsher decisions followed. Ecological systems were destroyed. Infrastructure was dismantled. In some cases, worlds were rendered permanently uninhabitable. The strategy horrified many observers. It also worked, at least temporarily. The flood required hosts. It required biomass. It required thriving ecosystems capable of sustaining further growth. Humanity began systematically denying those resources. Every world sacrificed represented another obstacle placed in the parasite's path. Forthencho became one of the strongest advocates for these increasingly desperate measures. The decision weighed heavily upon him. Surviving accounts consistently portray him as a leader who understood the cost of what he was ordering. Entire civilizations were disappearing because of his commands. Worlds built over centuries vanished in moments. Families abandoned ancestral homes knowing they would never return. Yet, the alternative appeared worse. Every colony preserved for sentimental reasons risked becoming another flood stronghold. Every delay risked the collapse of entire sectors. The Lord of Admirals chose survival. History would spend millions of years debating whether he had any other choice. As humanity's campaigns intensified, observers within the Forerunner Akumene began paying closer attention. Reports arriving from the frontier painted a deeply troubling picture. Human fleets were crossing into dispute territories. Entire systems were being sterilized. Populations were relocating on an unprecedented scale. Military activity increased dramatically throughout regions bordering Forerunner space. The Forerunners lacked critical context. They saw the actions. They did not see the reason behind them. To many Forerunner officials, humanity appeared to be behaving irrationally. Worlds were being destroyed without obvious justification. Borders were being violated. Expansionist behavior seemed increasingly common. What humanity viewed as desperate containment, the Forerunners increasingly viewed as aggression. The misunderstanding grew with every passing year. Human leaders attempted to explain the danger. Information was shared. Warnings were issued. Yet communication between great powers is rarely simple, particularly when centuries of mistrust already exist. The Forerunners remained skeptical. Their scientists had not encountered the flood directly. Their territories remained largely untouched. From their perspective, humanity's explanation sounded increasingly implausible. Some believed the flood threat was exaggerated. Others believed humanity was using the crisis as a justification for territorial expansion. Many simply assumed that a civilization under pressure was making poor decisions. Few grasped the truth. Humanity was fighting for its survival. And despite all of its sacrifices, despite every burned world and every desperate campaign, the flood was still winning. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. The parasite was not retreating, it was learning. Every strategy humanity developed eventually lost effectiveness. Every apparent breakthrough revealed new complications. The resistance researchers had celebrated turned out not to be a cure at all. The flood had merely chosen different priorities, reasons that would not become clear until much later. The war entered a darker phase. Humanity's hope of defeating the parasite through conventional means began fading. Forthencho saw it happening, the San Shayum saw it happening, and their government saw it happening. And somewhere beyond the borders of their civilization, the Forerunners continued watching a species that appeared increasingly unstable, increasingly aggressive, and increasingly dangerous. The collision between the two civilizations was no longer a possibility. It was becoming inevitable. Neither side understood the other, and neither side trusted the other. And between them stood a nightmare that neither civilization fully comprehended. Chapter 10. The first direct confrontations between humanity and the Forerunners did not begin with hatred. They began with confusion. From the perspective of ancient humanity, the situation was painfully clear. Entire worlds had already fallen to the flood. Colonies were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Every year brought new reports of outbreaks, new sacrifices, and new retreats. Humanity had exhausted nearly every conventional solution available to it. The war had become a struggle for survival, and survival demanded actions that would have been unthinkable during more peaceful times. From the perspective of the Forerunners, however, the situation looked very different. For generations, reports arriving from human space had grown increasingly alarming. Human fleets were entering regions traditionally claimed by the Akumene. Entire systems were being sterilized. Population centers vanished beneath waves of destruction. Military activity intensified across broad regions of the galaxy. To outside observers, humanity appeared less like a civilization defending itself and more like a civilization expanding through force. The crucial detail was that the flood remained largely invisible to the Forerunners. Not entirely unknown, but invisible in the ways that mattered. The parasite existed primarily within territories controlled by humanity and its allies. Human fleets encountered it constantly. Human colonies suffered its attacks. Human civilians paid the price. The Ecumene, protected by distance and circumstance, witnessed only fragments of the larger picture. Those fragments were misleading. When human forces entered a system and destroyed population centers, they understood exactly why they were doing it. The flood could not be allowed to spread. Every infected world represented a potential catastrophe. Every sacrifice prevented something worse. The Forerunners saw only destruction. When human fleets crossed borders and occupied strategic positions, they did so because those positions threatened vital containment operations. The flood did not care about political boundaries. Military planners could not afford to care either. The Forerunners saw only aggression. As the years passed, both civilizations became increasingly frustrated with one another. Human leaders struggled to convince the Ecumene that the threat was real. Forerunner officials struggled to understand why humanity's explanations seemed to justify every act of expansion and destruction. Trust, already fragile, continued eroding. The situation became even more complicated because humanity's campaign against the flood occasionally produced apparent successes. Entire regions that should have collapsed remained secure. Certain human populations demonstrated unusual resistance. Flood activity sometimes declined in areas where humanity had implemented extreme containment measures. To human observers, these developments suggested progress. To the Forerunners, they suggested something else entirely. Increasingly, influential voices within the Ecumene began asking uncomfortable questions. If humanity truly faced a threat as severe as claimed, why was its territory continuing to expand? Why were its fleets operating farther from home than ever before? Why did every explanation seem to result in greater military activity? The questions were not entirely unreasonable. They were simply based on incomplete information. History often punishes civilizations that act without understanding the full picture. The Ecumene was no exception. Eventually, political tensions transformed into military incidents. Human forces entered systems claimed by the Forerunners. Forerunner authorities demanded withdrawal. Human commanders refused. More systems became contested. More confrontations followed. Fleets that had spent centuries focused on entirely different threats suddenly found themselves staring at one another across disputed regions of space. The relationship deteriorated rapidly. For many human leaders, the situation felt absurd. They were fighting a war for survival against an enemy that threatened every species in the galaxy. Instead of receiving assistance, they found themselves accused of aggression by the most powerful civilization in existence. For many Forerunners, the situation felt equally absurd. A younger civilization appeared to be violating borders, destroying worlds, and destabilizing entire regions of space, while insisting that every action was justified by a threat few Forerunners had ever witnessed firsthand. Neither side felt understood, neither side felt heard, and so neither side trusted the other. During this period, another figure was beginning to rise within Forerunner society, the Didact. Future generations would remember him as one of the greatest military minds in the history of the Ecumene. Warrior servants admired him. Political leaders respected him. His reputation for discipline and strategic brilliance spread throughout the galaxy. Unlike many of his contemporaries, the Didact took threats seriously. He did not dismiss humanity as primitive or insignificant. He recognized that any civilization capable of challenging Forerunner authority deserved careful attention. Yet even he struggled to grasp the full nature of what humanity was facing. The flood remained a distant problem, largely confined to reports and fragmented intelligence. The Forerunners possessed vast resources, powerful fleets, and centuries of experience maintaining galactic order. Most believed that if the threat truly existed, it could be managed. Humanity knew otherwise. Every year of warfare had taught the same lesson. The flood was not a problem to be managed. It was a disaster to be survived. That distinction would eventually cost both civilizations dearly. As tensions escalated, humanity's military campaigns grew increasingly desperate. Entire sectors were sacrificed. Strategic withdrawals became commonplace. Refugee populations reached unprecedented levels. The alliance between humanity and the San Shayum endured, but even it showed signs of strain beneath the pressure of endless war. The flood continued advancing. The Forerunners continued misinterpreting humanity's actions. And somewhere within the highest levels of both civilizations, leaders were beginning to accept a possibility that once seemed impossible. War. Not against the flood, but against each other. It is one of the great tragedies of Halo's history that this conflict emerged at precisely the moment cooperation was needed most. Humanity possessed knowledge the Forerunners desperately needed. The Forerunners possessed resources that might have altered the course of the war against the flood. Together, they represented the greatest concentration of power in galactic history. Instead, they drifted toward confrontation. Every misunderstanding strengthened old suspicions. Every border dispute reinforced existing fears. Every failed diplomatic effort pushed the two civilizations further apart. The flood benefited from it all. The parasite continued growing in the shadows, while its future enemies exhausted themselves through distrust and conflict. By the time the first true battles between humanity and the Ecumene began, the opportunity for peaceful resolution had largely vanished. The galaxy's two greatest powers stood on opposite sides of a widening divide, each convinced the other represented a threat to stability. Neither realized that both were already losing a far more important war. The Human Forerunner War was about to begin, and its consequences would reshape the future of the galaxy for 100,000 years. Chapter 11. When the first major battles began erupting between humanity and the Forerunners, neither civilization believed it was starting a war. Both believed they were responding to one. That distinction mattered. The Human Forerunner War is often remembered through the lens of its outcome. History knows who won. History knows which civilization survived and which one was broken. Looking backward across thousands of years, it can be tempting to imagine the conflict as inevitable. It was not. The war emerged from countless smaller failures. Failures of communication, of trust, and understanding. Most importantly, it emerged from the fact that neither side possessed the same view of reality. Humanity saw a galaxy already under attack. Entire regions of space had been consumed by the flood. Billions were dead. Worlds had been sacrificed to slow an enemy that seemed incapable of defeat. Every difficult decision, every territorial violation, every military action was being taken within the context of survival. The Forerunners saw something very different. They saw a younger civilization destroying worlds, fleets crossing established borders, territories occupied without permission. They saw humanity acting aggressively while offering explanations that seemed increasingly implausible. To many within the Ecumene, the situation appeared obvious. Humanity had become a destabilizing force. The irony was devastating. The very actions humanity believed were saving the galaxy were convincing the Forerunners that humanity itself represented the threat. The first major military engagements reflected this confusion. Fleets clashed over systems that neither side viewed as optional. Human commanders considered those regions essential to containment efforts. Forerunner commanders considered them vital components of galactic order. Both sides believed retreat would create unacceptable consequences. Both sides were correct, and both sides were wrong. The scale of the conflict expanded rapidly. Humanity entered the war already exhausted. Generations of fighting the flood had consumed resources, manpower, and political stability. Entire sectors remained under constant threat. Colonies were struggling to recover from centuries of devastation. Military leaders now found themselves fighting a second enemy while the first continued advancing. This reality shaped every aspect of human strategy. Human commanders rarely sought conquest. Their primary objective remained survival. Fleets were deployed where they were needed most. Resources flowed toward critical regions. Every decision was influenced by the knowledge that the flood still existed beyond the battlefield. The Forerunners interpreted these actions differently. To them, humanity's behavior appeared increasingly erratic. Human forces seemed willing to accept extraordinary losses. They abandoned worlds with little warning. They fought fiercely in some regions, while withdrawing unexpectedly from others. Traditional strategic models often failed to explain their decisions. The explanation, of course, was that humanity was fighting two wars simultaneously. The Ecumene saw only one. Among the Forerunners, responsibility for confronting humanity increasingly fell to the warrior servants. This brought greater prominence to figures who would eventually become legendary throughout Halo history. None was more important than the Didact. Even among the Forerunners, the Didact was exceptional. He had earned his reputation through centuries of military service and strategic brilliance. Warrior servants respected him because he consistently accomplished what others considered impossible. Political leaders valued his judgment because he approached problems with discipline rather than ego. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not underestimate opponents simply because they possessed less power. This quality made him dangerous. It also made him one of the few Forerunners capable of appreciating humanity's capabilities. The Didact studied his enemy carefully. He reviewed campaigns. He analyzed battlefield reports. He examined patterns that commanders ignored. The conclusions he reached were complicated. Humanity was clearly aggressive by Forerunner standards. Entire systems had been devastated by human actions. Borders had been violated repeatedly. Military forces operated with alarming independence. Yet something about the conflict bothered him. The pieces did not fit together cleanly. Humanity's behavior often appeared irrational until viewed through a different lens. Their strategic priorities frequently contradicted traditional expansionist goals. They seemed willing to sacrifice territory they should have wanted to keep. They repeatedly made decisions that weakened their own position. To many observers, this looked like incompetence. The Didact suspected there was more to the story. Unfortunately, even he lacked critical information. While military campaigns intensified, humanity's alliance with the San Shayum remained intact. The partnership that had endured for ages continued functioning despite mounting pressure. The San Shayum scientists contributed research. Their fleets supported defensive operations. Their political leaders worked alongside human authorities in an increasingly desperate effort to preserve that which remained of their civilization. Together, they faced an impossible challenge. The flood continued advancing. The Forerunners continued attacking. Resources continued dwindling. Every year, the situation grew worse. It was during this period that Forthencho emerged fully as the central figure within humanity's war effort. Earlier chapters of this history introduced him as a respected military leader. Now he became something more. He became the face of humanity's survival. The responsibilities placed upon him were staggering. He commanded fleets across vast regions of space. He coordinated offensive operations involving countless worlds. He advised political leadership while simultaneously directing military campaigns. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Entire populations lived or died based upon his judgment. Yet the surviving records rarely portray him as triumphant. Instead, they depict a man carrying impossible burdens. Each victory required sacrifice. Each retreat condemned worlds. Each strategic success seemed temporary. Unlike many leaders throughout history, Forthencho understood that there would be no glorious resolution. He was not fighting to achieve greatness. He was fighting to preserve enough of humanity for a future generation to inherit. That distinction shaped everything he did. As the war continued, reports concerning the flood grew increasingly alarming. Human commanders warned that containment efforts were failing. Entire sectors faced collapse. Strategic models predicted outcomes that bordered on apocalyptic. Information was transmitted repeatedly to Forerunner authorities. The warnings received little attention. Many within the Ecumene viewed them as propaganda. Others believed humanity was exaggerating the threat to justify its behavior. A few listened, but not enough. The tragedy of the Human Forerunner War lies partly in this failure. The galaxy's two greatest civilizations possessed the resources necessary to confront the Flood together. Humanity had experience, the Forerunners had power. Combined, they might have altered the course of history. Instead, they spent their strength fighting one another, and the Flood watched, and it learned, and it grew. And with every passing year, the cost of the misunderstanding increased. By the time the conflict reached its height, neither side could easily step back. Too many worlds had been lost, too many lives had been sacrificed, too much blood had already been shed. The war had developed its own momentum. Humanity and the Ecumene were now fully committed to a conflict neither could truly afford. Somewhere beyond the battlefield, the Flood continued evolving into something far more dangerous than either civilization yet understood. And hidden within the deepest mysteries of the galaxy, another figure waited. A being older than Forerunners, older than humanity, older than almost every event described in its history, the Primordial. Its role in the story was approaching, and when it finally emerged, the course of galactic history would change forever.